we'll go back on the record. Doctor, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, are you ready to pick back up with your direct?
I am, thank you, Your Honor. And I think there was the parties had conferred about a demonstrative exhibit right before the break, and I think we've resolved that issue.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right. Dr. Hammers, before we broke for lunch, you were starting to talk about some of the hypotheses that you tested in this case. Before we get to that, I want to go back to one thing that we discussed earlier in your testimony, which is the groupings of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back, wounds A through F, that we were discussing earlier. And I'm going to show you an exhibit that we looked at earlier, which shows the wounds and the measurements. Do you have that exhibit in front of you?
Not quite yet.
Okay, thank you. It's
Okay. This one?
it's the one with the measurements on it.
Oh, okay. I got you.
Do you have the phone in front of you?
I do
Dr.
now.
Hammers. Now, in your review of Dr. Cruz's materials from the autopsy, did she document the trajectory that these wounds took within Ms. Mullis's body?
She did.
And going through the wounds from A to F, can you tell us what those trajectories were?
Sure. So wound A was from the back of the body toward the front, from the right of the body to the left, and slightly downward.
What about wound B?
B was the same, right to left, forward and slightly downward.
What about C?
It was also the same, front to back, right to left and slightly downward.
And D?
And that was the same, front to back, or back to front, sorry, back to front, right to left and slightly downward.
What about E?
E was back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
And what about F?
Back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
Were you able to determine from Dr. Cruz's documentation the specific path that any of these wounds took through Ms. Mullis's chest?
So she did document like rib spaces that they went through, and the injuries with A and B, she documented specifically the organs that they struck.
Does documentation of the rib spaces help you determine with some specificity the path that certain wounds took through her chest?
Yes, it gives you either an ending point or a point along the way that you can tell if it's going slightly downward, upward, or sharply upward or downward.
Is there something with people's rib cages called an intercostal space?
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Yes, so you have 12 ribs, and in between your ribs, that's called the intercostal space. And so you have your first rib, and then your second rib, and your first intercostal space is between the first and second rib, and so on as you go down the rib cage.
And every person has 12 ribs?
Yes, in general, yes.
So for everyone, though, the numbering of those intercostal spaces is the same?
Correct. It's the same. It's always the space below it is the number of the rib above it.
And so for which of these wounds were you able to determine, because of the other things in Ms. Mullis's body that they passed through, what their more precise path was?
So A and B went through rib spaces, and E and F went through rib spaces. C and D only went into the soft tissue and muscle of the back.
I'm going to show you another demonstrative, which we conferred with the state about before the break. This is purely a demonstrative exhibit, Your Honor. It's not being offered into evidence. We've referred to it as demonstrative A. Do you see the demonstrative in front of you?
I do.
Would using demonstrative A assist you in describing your testimony, Dr. Hammers?
Yes.
What is depicted in demonstrative A?
So demonstrative A has the wounds A through F. It is a look at from the side of the body. So looking basically like from the right to the left side. So it's two-dimensional, but it has all the wounds A through F. It has their relative location on the body, and then the direction with an arrow that the pathway travels based off of the locations that Dr. Cruz had documented in her autopsy report.
And does Figure A depict the trajectories and the relative depths of wounds A through F based on your understanding of Dr. Cruz's documentation?
Yes, it does.
Did any of this, the information that's depicted in the demonstrative in front of you, the trajectories, the relative depths, the directions of the wounds, did that assist you in your understanding of which wounds you consider to be grouped together in some way?
I would say yes.
And how?
So it allowed me to understand that A through D had a similar, essentially a similar pathway in the body, and that E and F had a very different and distinct pathway in the body. It also explained and confirmed my suspicion about wounds A and B being caused from the tine staying in the body and being much deeper than wound C, and also confirmed that wound D, where it did not come out of the clothing, it also only went into the body a very shallow depth.
Now, from what you told us before the break, it's your opinion that Ms. Mullis experienced wound D at a different time from A, B, and C. Is that right?
Well, different from, I guess, the grouping of A, B, and C, but what I've testified to is that from my review, A and B did not leave the body, so then C would have been at a different time than D, essentially. And
is your understanding of the trajectories of these wounds, is that inconsistent with your understanding of, is anything about the trajectories of these wounds inconsistent with your opinions about when and in what order Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds?
No.
All right. In thinking about the trajectories of these wounds, what were the trajectories of wounds A through F relative to Ms. Mullis's body?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think of and I understand that we're not talking in terms of the actual position that Ms. Mullis's body was in when she experienced these injuries, whether she's laying down or standing up. I'm not asking you about that, but treating her body as a vertical object, where were the wounds relative in terms of the trajectory? What was the trajectory relative to her body?
I'm still not 100% sure that I understand what you mean. Or, I don't know, are you asking about the anatomic position and how we measure them, or are you asking about something else?
I appreciate that question. If we treat the axis of the body as a vertical axis, how would you describe the trajectory of these wounds relative to that axis?
Oh, I think I understand now. Okay, so they're all going from the back of the body toward the front. They are all going from the right side of the body toward the left, and then A through D are going slightly downward, and E and F are so toward her feet, essentially, but only very slightly, and then E and F are going up toward her head.
And those wounds A to C, when you say they're going slightly downward, are those near horizontal?
Very close to horizontal, yes.
Okay. Before we broke, I think we were starting to talk about your hypotheses in this case, and I think the hypothesis that you were discussing before we broke was the hypothesis that someone swung this corn rake into Ms. Mullis's back. And I apologize because I don't remember. Did you tell us what your conclusion was about this hypothesis?
I honestly don't remember.
Well, what was your hypothesis? What was your hypothesis, or what was your conclusion about the hypothesis that Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds in her back from someone swinging the corn rake into her back?
So my conclusion is that the pathway is not consistent with the features of the corn rake and the space within the shed to be able to cause this set of injuries in these pathways.
So taking leaving the position of the shed out of your analysis for a minute, were you able to determine, without knowing anything about the shed on the Mullis farm, whether this hypothesis was true or not?
The swinging
Yes.
hypothesis? Well, with swinging, that can't describe, if you sort of have swinging in any sort of way, shape, or form, it can't describe the entire set of injuries that have occurred.
Why not?
Because there's 4 tines to the rake, there's 6 injuries plus the scrape to her back, and they are in different directions.
Is it possible or were you able to disprove the hypothesis that someone caused these injuries in Ms. Mullis's back by someone swinging the rake into her back more than once?
I was.
And what's your determination about that hypothesis?
That is not true because the clothing does not support that.
How does the clothing not support that?
So the outer coat of the clothing has even fewer holes than what we saw on the inner clothing, indicating that at least some of the tines of the rake did not exit the clothing in total at all.
Now, is it your testimony that the physical characteristics of the shed on the Mullis property contributed to your determination that someone could not have swung this rake into Ms. Mullis's back to cause these injuries?
Yes, that's part of it.
And you said that you visited the shed on the property, is that right?
I did.
What was it about the shed on the property that contributed to your opinions that this is not possible?
So the openings in the shed are very narrow and leave little room to either side in order to swing a rake. And that would mean swinging from overhead would be necessary, and that does not add up with the direction of the wounds and the number of the wounds.
I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked. I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked as 731. Do you recognize what is depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What is it?
This is one of the walkways in the shed.
Does Exhibit 731 truly and accurately depict the interior of the Mullis shed at the time that you visited it?
To the best of my recollection, yes, it does.
All right, we'll seek to admit Exhibit 731, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection.
731 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you have any understanding of where in this shed Ms. Mullis might have? Let me ask you a better question. The hypotheses that you were considering about Ms. Mullis having someone swing the rake into her back in this shed, what areas of the shed did you consider in that hypothesis?
So basically the only open areas of the shed where you could walk, which were all very narrow within the shed. And then there was an area in the shed where it was reported that she was going to get a carrier, and that was in an area in one of those narrow walkways.
From your review of photographs and descriptions of this shed and from your own visit to the shed, did you determine any area inside of the shed that would allow for the hypothesis that someone swung a corn rake into Ms. Mullis's back in that area of the shed?
I did not.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received wounds A through F from someone pushing the corn rake into her back?
I did consider that, yes.
And what was your conclusion about that hypothesis?
So my conclusion was, from my experience and training, I've not seen any kind of injuries like that, with having multiple tines of any type of object able to push into somebody, and comparing that to other cases that I have, which have not been from a corn rake, but from different weapons, that not being ever reported to me, ever seen by me, or anything that I've witnessed any of my colleagues having, where someone has been able to push an object like that through somebody's clothes and into their body one time, let alone multiple times.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received these injuries by falling onto this corn rake one or more times?
Yes.
And what did you determine about that hypothesis?
So from considering that hypothesis, based off of all of the information that I reviewed, that was the most likely and reasonable hypothesis, given the location, the distribution of the injuries, the features of the injuries, the features of the corn rake, and my experience in training.
We agree that if Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries by falling, she had to have fallen on this corn rake more than once. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Why does the hypothesis that she fell on this corn rake fit with the evidence as you understand it?
So the fact that it appears that she received wounds A, B, and C clustered together, and that wound D is in a similar area to C but is much more shallow, and there's movement of wounds A and B, and all of those injuries are in a similar distribution. I would expect that there could be more shallow injuries from her falling, even potentially from different heights or different distances above the ground. And then the change in that orientation with wounds, tines A and B staying inside those wounds, and then her sustaining the other two injuries. So to me, when I look at all the features of the wounds consistent with coming from the same object, and then the similarities in their orientation, that to me is the most likely and reasonable scenario for how those injuries occurred. And it fits with the differences of the features that I saw inside and outside of the body with wounds A and B.
Did you get any information from Ms. Mullis's medical history about prescription medications that she was taking around the time of her death?
Yes.
From the medical records, what were you able to determine about that?
So she had 5 medications that were listed as her current medications. 3 of them were medications that can sort of have a similar effect on the body, and in my training and experience were the more significant of the 3 medications that she was on that were listed in her medical record. 2 of them appeared to be medication she was on typically, and then 1 of them was a medication she was given post-operatively after her procedure.
And what would have been the consequences of those medications?
So those medications all can have similar effects of dizziness, somnolence, meaning sleepiness, and kind of like, those are like the 2 main, dizziness and tiredness.
Did the toxicology report that accompanied the autopsy in this case reveal those medications?
Can you ask me that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Did the toxicology report that was conducted as part of Dr. Cruz's autopsy in this case, did it reveal those medications?
It did not.
And is there a reason why?
So the toxicology panel that was tested for does not include those medications in what is tested for. So you have to have a panel of medications that you're testing for, and you're only going to potentially get positive results from the medications that are being looked for.
What is the generally accepted practice in the field of forensic pathology with respect to autopsies for seeking more than a basic toxicology panel in a case?
So the recommendation from the National Association of Medical Examiners is that you know the medication somebody is potentially taking, weigh them in your evaluation, and order testing that is appropriate for the information that you have.
And in this situation, given the information that was available with respect to the autopsy, was this a situation where a generally accepted practice would be to seek more than a basic panel for the toxicology testing?
So in my training and experience, yes, this panel is, in my experience, and using this same lab, so I'm familiar with the panel, is a limited panel and misses medications that a very high number of the population actually take routinely. So it's really looking for substances of abuse or medications that are commonly abused.
You talked earlier before the break and in your testimony just now about seeking contextual information as part of your determinations, seeking information about medical history and the area where someone's injuries might have occurred, and looking at investigative records. Is there any concern for you as a forensic pathologist that contextual information could bias you in some way to information that you're seeing at autopsy?
I would say no. Our job and the recommendation of all of our national organizations is that the job of the forensic pathologist is to be trained and have experience to weigh all of those items and balance out what is in them with what we have at autopsy, and to ultimately make a decision about cause and manner of death. So that's the whole reason that we're trained, is to gather that information, assess it, and form opinions.
Do you need that contextual information in certain cases to reach your determinations?
I would say that we need it in the vast majority of cases, but certainly cases that are more complicated, but we never know sort of how a case is going to turn out and the complexities that will come with it. So best practices are to have the information that's available through the steps that we described, if it's available and accessible.
Did you reach an opinion in this case, Dr. Hammers, about how you would classify the manner of Ms. Mullis's death?
I did.
And what is your conclusion after consideration of all of the background evidence and the evaluation of the hypotheses that you considered in this case?
My opinion is that the manner of death is best classified as an accident.
Why is that?
All of the information that I had available to me to review, it fits with the injuries that were seen. It makes logical sense. There was, witness statements, there was medical information that all came together to add up to what was seen on the body. So there wasn't anything about the injuries and how Ms. Mullis was described as being found, or the implement that was found in her, the way it was reported, the way her body was reported, that made this inconsistent with anything but an accident. I'm sorry, consistent with anything but an accident. I apologize.
For a forensic pathologist to determine that the manner of death in a case is a homicide, what is the generally accepted practice in forensic pathology about the level of proof that a forensic pathologist needs to have to make that determination?
So typically we use to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, but another way to say that would be that it's far more likely than not. So it's not just 51% that this is a homicide. It's that all of the information that you have far outweighs this being a homicide than anything else.
Is your determination that that the manner of Ms. Mullis's death was an accident, is that dependent on an understanding that her death must have occurred in the shed?
I would say no. It's not dependent on that, although I haven't seen any information that indicates that this occurred at any other location.
Is there a process as a medical examiner for a medical examiner to reconsider the official cause of death that they identified in a death certificate or in other documentation about a case?
Yes.
What is that process?
So it's, there's no sort of formal name for it, but basically any case that you have, someone can always come and ask you to reconsider it. The death certificate is always subject to being able to be changed with new information that changes your cause or manner of death. And so anytime somebody poses new information, you can take that information, review the case in light of that new information, and then decide if you will or will not change the death certificate.
Are there any situations in your career where someone has come to you with new information about a case where you've made an official determination about cause or manner of death?
Yes, there have been.
And under generally accepted practices in forensic pathology, what is the response of a forensic, what should the response of a forensic pathologist be in that situation?
Well, in every case that I've had or other people have had where I've worked, the information that comes is taken seriously. It's reviewed. Typically, it's reviewed with someone who is a superior to you. So I would review it, then I would sit down with my boss and discuss it, and we would come to an understanding of, you know, what that material, how that material that was new weighed into what we already had, and if that changed the ultimate opinions or not.
Are you familiar with a concept called implicit bias?
Yes.
What is that?
I'm going to object. It's outside the scope of this witness's knowledge.
I agree. Sustained.
Do you understand, are you familiar with a field of science called biomechanical engineering?
Yes.
And in general terms, what's your understanding of what that field is?
Again, I'm going to object. Same objection.
Did you want to respond?
I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt the court. This is in Dr. Hammers' report that she considered this field and that she consulted with an expert in this field in reaching her opinions. I don't intend to go into the details of this field. That's not my purpose, but just to, that's the purpose for these questions, Your Honor.
I believe they have a biomechanical expert that is the next witness. I don't know why we have to rehash this. It's outside our scope.
Very, very, let's keep it very, very limited.
Understood, Your Honor.
Very limited. And again, I'll read the report. Obvious, you know, this isn't a jury trial. Let's try to move this along, please, Ms. Thompson.
Understood,
Okay.
Your Honor. Let me ask you this question, Dr. Hammers. Do forensic scientists consult in some cases with biomechanical experts in reaching their opinions?
Yes.
Is that a generally accepted practice in your field?
Yes, it is.
Did you consult with a biomechanical expert in considering your opinions in this case?
I certainly read their report, but I had my own opinions separate from what the biomechanical expert had to say. It happened that their opinion supported what I already believed to be the case, which was this was an accident, but my opinions and my conclusions were made outside of that.
The opinions that you've offered in your testimony here today, are any of those opinions based on new developments in the field of forensic pathology since 2019?
No.
Are these opinions that you could have offered in 2019?
Yes.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Is the report that you referenced reading in the field of biomechanical engineering in this case a report from someone named Dr. Susan Boley?
Yes.
And did you consider the information in Dr. Boley's opinion, the report that you read in reaching your opinions in this case?
I did consider it, yes.
Your Honor, on that basis, we are seeking to admit Dr. Boley's report in this case, and I think that we could take up the issue of its admissibility at another time, but we are, at this point, making a proffer that we'd seek to admit it based on this testimony.
And for the reasons we've already stated early on in testimony earlier this morning, we have the same objection to that based upon the same cases that I cited.
Okay, sure. And we'll save that argument for another time so we can keep moving forward.
I have no other questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Dr. Hammers, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You agree the wounds that caused Amy Mullis's death, as they've been described by Kelly Cruz, you agree with that, correct?
That the set of puncture wounds caused her death?
Right.
Yes, that's
Right.
correct.
And there are other injuries to her body that were observed at autopsy, these blunt force injuries that you've described?
Yes, there were blunt force injuries, correct.
So you agree with Cruz on, well, she calls them sharp force injuries, you call them something else, but it's the stab wounds that caused her death, correct?
I wouldn't call them stab wounds, but the penetrating wounds, yes.
So the penetrating wounds, as observed at autopsy, you agree with Dr. Cruz that those caused Amy Mullis's death, correct?
They caused her death, correct.
Right. And the number of injuries, Kelly Cruz counted correctly, would that be true?
A through F, yes.
Okay, and you agree that A through F were the injuries that were observed at autopsy?
Correct.
You don't have any contrary information or anything that you observed from the autopsy of Kelly Cruz that would contradict that, correct?
In regard to the
number of injuries.
If we're just talking to the ones on her back, yes, I agree with
Correct,
that.
that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You agree with Cruz on the orientation of the injuries on the back, correct?
Yes.
You don't have any dispute with the measurements that she made with regard to the distance between the injuries, correct?
Correct. I'm not disagreeing with her measurements.
Or the depth of the injuries?
I'm not disagreeing with her depth measurements. 4
of the injuries, A through D, were downward, and the other 2, E and F, were upward?
Correct.
Okay. And I think I asked you this already about all the blunt force injuries. You agree those were all documented correctly. Is that right?
As far as, I would say, the location and the general description.
And the photographs that you were able to observe.
Yes.
I think the only thing you really, maybe were critical of Dr. Cruz on was that she should have taken more photos of the internal injuries. Is that true?
I mean, if we're just talking about the autopsy process, I would say yes, she could have taken more internal photographs.
So what it really boils down to is your disagreement with Dr. Cruz is that she ruled this a homicide and you would have ruled it an accident, right? Is that what this really comes down to?
I mean, I would say that's the final statement, but I think there's other things in between that I don't agree with the way that she's described them or testified to them.
You may have done the autopsy differently, correct? You may have done different things if you would have done the autopsy to Amy Mullis.
True, maybe.
And that differs from pathologist to pathologist, isn't that true?
I mean, yes, there's going to be some variation.
Right. I mean, the core of what you do is basically the same, but there may be some variations there, correct?
True.
All right. Now, I know that you discussed these hypotheses here, but swinging the rake could cause the injuries that we see on her back, correct?
I don't know that they could, actually.
Not at all? Can completely exclude it?
I believe that I testified that I did exclude that as a possibility.
Okay. You could push the rake into Amy Mullis's back, correct?
I believe I disagreed with that as well.
Okay. So an attacker let's assume there's an attacker, okay, that's not an accident. They could take the rake and use it as a weapon and push it into Amy Mullis's back, right? They could do that.
I believe I just testified just a little while ago that I've never seen that, I've never read that, and I've never read any report of somebody pushing a corn rake into somebody's back.
I'm not sure there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Your objection is?
I apologize, I'm not trying to get animated, Your Honor, but that really assumes, obviously, the exact issue that we're here to talk about, whether there's another murder with a corn rake. Because the issue here is whether this was a murder, Your Honor, that's why we're here.
Okay, well. Kelly, can you read me the question again?
I'm not sure that there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Mr. Brown, I guess, maybe can you just ask a new question?
So I will. So I think we both can agree that the death by corn rake is something unique. Would that be true?
I would say it's unique in the specific implement, but there certainly have been cases of people dying with other farming type of implements that are in the category of a rake.
Or other instruments that are sharp enough to penetrate the body, correct?
Yes.
You see that all the time.
I wouldn't say all the time, but we see it
But like a knife wound.
enough.
Right? Like
Right,
some-
but this is very different than a knife
I
wound.
understand, but it's something that penetrates the body that causes death. You have seen that before.
Yes, correct.
Okay. We can both agree that the corn rake, specifically as an implement to do that, is unique. True?
Yes, that's true.
There are 6 injuries to the back of Amy Mullis that are penetrating injuries, correct?
Yes,
4 times on the corn rake.
yes,
That means it penetrated her body more than 1 time, correct?
yes.
All right. There has been a suggestion by Dr. Cruz that it was 2, very likely 3 times, and I assume you would agree with that.
The only thing that I would say is I think there had to be more than one episode of her being penetrated, but that doesn't imply that it was like that there was no contact with the body or no tines in the body when those additional penetrations occurred.
All right. So there's 4 times on the corn rake, correct?
Yes,
We have 4 wounds that are in the same orientation in that you're nodding, so you agree with me, correct?
No.
No?
they're in the same direction, but they do
Okay.
not have the same orientation on the surface of the
Okay,
skin.
my apologies. But they're in the same direction, correct? And there are 4 of those, A, B, C, and D?
The path through the body is the same, yes, or similar.
And then there are 2 others that you have identified that would have happened at a different time, correct?
I don't know that I would say a different time,
How
but
would you say it? How did you say it?
they're traveling in a different direction, so they likely happened together, but I wouldn't specify the time.
So you've classified this as an accident in your opinion, correct?
Yes,
So that means that the corn rake would have to be in a position where Amy Mullis could fall on it, correct?
correct.
So it would have to be laying presumably on the ground, right?
I don't know that I would draw that conclusion because I'm not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't speak to the exact forces, but she would have to have enough acceleration of her body to generate enough force for that to pierce her clothing and her body.
Putting the rake on the ground, that would probably be the place furthest away from her where enough force could be generated to cause the injuries that you see, correct?
So again, I think it's very plausible that the rake could be on the ground, but I can't speak to the specific forces that it would take because I haven't done those calculations and don't have that expertise.
She would have to lose consciousness or strength, right, in order to fall. Would that be right?
She would have to do what?
She'd have to like pass out,
In order to fall?
correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like alarmed, I'm sorry. No, I mean, you can trip and fall, you could step on equipment and fall. Like, I don't think that consciousness is inferred from her falling.
But it would have to be with enough force that the tines of the rake could penetrate her body, correct?
Correct.
And that this happened multiple times, correct?
Some of the tines had to have penetrated her body more than one
So
time.
she fell on the rake more than once,
Correct.
fell on it more than twice, very likely, correct?
Based off of what I've described, I think it's likely that it is more than twice.
You provided some testimony as to the location of this incident, and I believe you called it, you correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of barn or outbuilding?
I think I called it a shed.
A shed, okay. So are you presuming that Amy Mullis was killed in the shed?
I'm not presuming that she was killed, number one, because I told you that my opinion is it's an accident. But number two, I haven't seen any information that suggests or indicates that this happened anywhere but in the shed.
Who provided the information that it would have happened in the shed?
Well, the information that I've reviewed has no information that this likely happened anywhere else. There's blood droplets
I'm
in the
asking you
shed.
who provided it. Who provided the information? Todd Mullis, right? He's the one that provided the information that she was in the shed? Isn't that right?
That is not what my opinion is. If I can complete my answer, then I can explain to you where I got the
Go ahead.
information from. Okay. So yes, there is statements from Mr. Mullis and his son about finding her in the shed. There are pictures from the deputies that went to the shed where there are blood droplets in the shed. There's no blood droplets anywhere else that are identified, and nobody, even the police reports that I read, indicated that they suspected that this happened anywhere else.
So Todd Mullis removed Amy Mullis from the scene, correct? You know that.
My understanding is that he and his son did.
And they would have put her in a car or vehicle, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Traveled for a distance,
That's my understanding, yes.
pulled over because he was told to do so by EMTs. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So the ambulance and whoever was sent out to help her could meet on the roadside to assist, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So there's no 911 call that happens from the farm. You never reviewed that, correct?
My understanding is that it happened like on the way to the, toward the hospital.
Right, en route to the hospital, correct? Or
Correct.
en route to wherever he was taking it?
Correct.
To get back to the information that you're relying on that came from Todd Mullis, he provided information as to Amy Mullis being in the barn or the shed, correct?
So I just want to be clear. Are you saying that Mr. Mullis gave me materials to review?
No.
Is that what you're asking me?
Well, you told us that you reviewed the investigation in this case, right? And that he provided statements?
Okay, that's what I just want to be clear on. So what you're asking me is his statements to the police or to the hospital or to
Right,
first
or wherever
responders,
they
whoever.
were, whatever source.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So how would you answer that question?
I'm sorry, what are you asking me about
I
then?
said, the only person that provided information as to where Amy Mullis was located was Todd Mullis and possibly Tristan, correct? They're the only other two that were at the farm.
That's my understanding, yes.
Right. So only those two people. So there's no independent confirmation of that by law enforcement or anybody else that you know of, correct?
As far as specifically finding her the way that they did, it was the two of them, correct?
And his description of Amy Mullis being in the barn with the rake in her back, that is his and his alone, correct?
I believe his son also stated that.
Okay, those two, but nobody else?
That's my understanding, yes.
Did you factor into any of your opinions any information that Amy Mullis was unsteady on the day that she died?
I mean, I would say that I factored in the complaints that she had that were reported and the medications that she had and the complaints she had prior to her procedure and the fact that she had a procedure just about 4 days before that.
So what's the answer to that, that she was unsteady or that you had information that she was?
I'm saying I took all of that into consideration.
Okay. Todd Mullis also describes her that way, is that right?
I believe he described her as just coming back to helping on the farm that day because she had been staying, not working because of her procedure, and that she had complained about not feeling well in some way and was going back inside to rest.
Okay. So with regard to the amount of force that it would be needed to observe the injuries that you saw or that you also observed from Cruz's autopsy, you're claiming that those all came from an accidental fall, is that right?
Well, my determination is that the manner of death is an accident.
Right, maybe okay. So you were asked about pushing the rake into her back. Your testimony is that you've not seen those kinds of injuries before.
No, my testimony was that my training and experience has not identified situations where something with multiple objects on it have been able to be pushed in. That's what you were describing, right? Somebody standing and pushing into somebody's back multiple times into somebody's body at the same time.
You've seen the rake, correct?
I've seen pictures of it.
Or photos of it. You could take the rake, if you wanted to do it, and push it into somebody's back and stab them, right?
So what I said was, I do not, in my experience, you cannot do that with
I'm
multiple
asking
times
you
on a rake.
now about the rake itself that you've seen pictures of. You could take the rake and push it into somebody's back and use it as a weapon. Isn't that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. I think this was asked and answered.
Overruled.
In my experience and in my opinion, you cannot do that.
You can't do that, but you can fall on the rake. You can't push the rake into somebody. Is that what you're telling us?
I'm saying in my experience and my training, no, you can't. But again, I am not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't answer that for you with...
Go ahead. No, finish.
I cannot answer that for you with calculations, but I'm telling you from my training and experience, I've not seen that, and I have not read, I have not experienced that. And
Okay.
I do not believe that you could take multiple times and just push them into somebody intentionally.
But you can fall on the rake and that could happen.
Correct, because you're getting enough force to fall on the rake.
How about kick the rake into her back or stomp on it if they put the rake against her skin or put the rake against her back? That could happen?
So theoretically that could happen. I can't answer about the forces on that, but I've also not been presented with any information that suggests that that's what happened.
Okay. Dr. Hammers, you indicated that you take into account the investigation, correct?
Yes.
That would include all information that's been provided to you.
Yes.
I assume if you were missing some information or you thought you were, you would request that?
If I felt like there was something out there that would help me with my analysis, I would ask for it, yes.
And information that, particularly since Todd Mullis was the suspect here, statements from him would be potentially relevant to your determination. Isn't that true?
Are you asking the ones that I had or
No,
something?
I'm just asking you in general terms. I mean, statements that he would have made about what happened would be relevant to your determination.
They could be, yes.
His motive might be part of that.
Again, it could be.
If he had a reason to kill Amy Mullis, that would be something you would factor in?
It would be, and it would be something I would factor in. It would, I would take it with the other information.
I mean, if a defendant confesses to a shooting, you might call that a homicide, or at least factor in a statement if they confessed to that type of crime. Is that right?
I would say I wouldn't necessarily call it a homicide just because of their statement, and if it didn't make sense that it could be a homicide from my autopsy, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody told me it was a homicide. I would use that as a piece of information with the rest of my examination.
And if a defendant would confess to a stabbing, that might contribute to your finding that it's a homicide. Is that correct?
Again, I wouldn't make that determination off of somebody's confession. I would make it off of the entire amount of information that I have. Again, if it didn't make sense that someone could stab that person based off of the circumstances and the set of injuries, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody was confessing to it.
And if Todd Mullis in this case made the statement that Amy was a cheating whore, or that she needed to,
I'm sorry, I apologize, Your Honor.
or that she needed to go to hell because she was a cheating whore, would you factor that in?
Objection, Your Honor.
This is evidence that was at the trial.
This is I guess the question is if. So without understanding, I'll withdraw my question, or my objection, Your Honor.
Right. The witness may answer.
So again, I would take that into consideration as information that I would have.
Did you factor that in this case?
To my knowledge, I did not have that information.
Okay. Does that change your opinion if
It
you
does
made
not.
those statements?
It does not.
Okay. Yep, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Just a couple of questions, Your Honor. Wounds A through F are not stab wounds, in your opinion, is that right?
Correct.
And are your opinions in this case dependent on whether Ms. Mullis experienced the injuries that we're talking about in this case in the shed of the Mullis farm or somewhere else?
No, they're not dependent on her being in the shed.
Have you received any information that there's been any confession in this case by Todd Mullis?
I have not been given any information that indicates that Mr. Mullis stated that he intentionally harmed Amy. Mullis.
Is it your understanding there's any statement by Mr. Mullis that he intentionally or otherwise harmed her?
No, to my knowledge, I have not reviewed anything to that end.
You were asked some questions about the sort of the nature of your disagreement with Dr. Cruz and whether there's things you agree on and things you disagree on. Do you disagree with the sort of objective measurements and objective data that Dr. Cruz developed from the autopsy?
I do not.
Do you disagree with her interpretation of this autopsy?
I do.
Do you disagree with the cause and manner of death that Dr. Cruz ascribed to this autopsy? Or ascribed to Ms. Mullis's death, excuse me.
Yes, I do.
Do you is your conclusion that this was an accident, does that necessarily exclude the possibility that this was a homicide?
I mean, in the realm of all things possible, anything is possible, but we are asked and tasked with the job of reviewing all of the information and making an opinion decision about the manner of death, and what is reasonable, what is likely, and what is most likely, and matches with all of the and is consistent with all of the information that we have available.
One moment, Your Honor.
Any recross?
Nothing else.
Thank you, doctor. You may step down.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Judge, while we're waiting on schedule, I have a 3:30 matter I need to take up, so I may need to leave. I think I mentioned this maybe yesterday. Even if we don't have a break, I may just get up and leave. Is that okay with you?
It's okay with me unless you would like us to.
No, the next witness is not mine, so I'm good. So I just don't want to delay things, please. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Ms. Thompson, did you want to start your next witness, or do you want to take a short break before we do that?
What's the first preference?
Kelly, what do you want to do? Keep going? Okay, right. We can get started, it sounds like.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. We call Dr. Valentina Nye, Your Honor.
Dr. Nye, you can take your time, come forward and have a seat in the chair to my left, please.